You want to know why you absolutely have to read The Knowledge Gene? Well, let me frame it in the form of a question. What if there was absolute scientific proof that something inside of us enables us to learn and is why we're human? A gene. And what would be the consequences if that proof was rock solid and would include everybody learning better, because we would start to learn in different ways that cherished this gene or set of genes or genes in context of many, many other moving parts. And we would have no choice once we knew this but to change how we are going about excluding so many people from enjoying knowledge that is, so to speak, their birthright due to genes, but human behaviors have somehow caused us to lose the plot, not only the plot of this birthright, but of how memory operates, how that we can all enjoy memory in a variety of ways, and ways that would suit each and every one of us because it's in our genes to do so. Although we can't say everyone, because as Lynne Kelly has discovered in The Knowledge Gene, people who have damage or something awry with particular genes have trouble learning and remembering and even detecting the prosody or the way that I'm using my voice to have particular tones and so forth. They may not be able to detect it at all. And so, this gives us great clues about the nature of information. In any case, Lynne Kelly is, you probably already know, an incredible author. The Knowledge Gene is an outstanding book, an absolutely monumental follow-up to The Memory Code, which I've been able to speak with her about before, and of course, Memory Craft, which gets very, very deep into the memory techniques that so many of us love and cherish and keep alive by putting into action. But the Knowledge Gene is extraordinary and unique because it helps us understand more about what it is that is particularly human, common, and to be cherished at a deeper and deeper level because we have this knowledge that Lynne has helped unearth and explain in her beautiful style. And so, without going on much further, if you like content like this and the interview you're about to see with Lynne, make sure to absolutely smash that thumbs up as if you were using a tool from the ancient world here in modern times to have the signal ring as far as possible that we humans still care about the miracle of memory. And get subscribed if you're new here. This is a very, very interesting, in-depth conversation about what's at stake if we can get everybody included in the game of learning, which I don't want to misuse terms like birthright, but it seems to me exactly the implication here. And as Lynne suggests, we've got to do something. We've got to get together to help make it possible for more and more people to learn and learn with the joy that those of us who have found memory techniques find. Delight each and every second as we simply absorb things, as our genes seem designed by evolution itself to do. So, speaking of doing, without further ado, I give you this wonderful conversation with Lynne Kelly and highly, 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 highly recommend that you simply must read The Knowledge Gene. Lynne, so good to see you, and congrats on The Knowledge Gene. I mean, how do you do it, really, to pump out so many great books again and again?
It's because the stuff is just so interesting. Memory is the most interesting topic around.
So it's not an NF1 gene or FOXP2, is that what it was, at FOXP2, that is driving you to do it? I mean, you tell a story where you're yanked into this new area of interest. And the first thing that I have to ask is, well, is it that your interest is yanked into it, or is it a genetic compulsion, or is that the wrong way to think about it?
It definitely wasn't the genetics that yanked me in. It was the completely new lens with which I could look at all my previous work on knowledge systems. And so FOXP2 is nicknamed the language gene and has been linked to our use of language. But this other gene, NF1, I was contacted by Dr. Andrea Elvishir, who was working on this gene and realised it linked to all the other aspects of knowledge that we use, in particular music, art, connection to place, which gives you memory palaces, and characters and stories. And all the things we use, we are genetically encoded to use, but add in a lot of music and art as well, and all linked together.
Right. So there's a big theme or an underlying current, which is what is science, what isn't science. And I was kind of purposely asking it in a weird way, like, is it that the gene compels us to do a thing or whatnot? But very specifically, what you're finding, if I understand it correctly, is that NF1, I think is called, it is a gene that suppresses our
Tumors.
body's wish to make tumors or something like that.
Yeah.
Or not that our body wishes to make tumors, but somehow a gene that normally suppresses the production of tumors, if that is gone awry somehow, it affects learning. And that then leads to the adventure that you went on to research all of this. So is that a correct interpretation of the gene?
This gene is a tumor suppressor gene. So all or mostly the research on it is because it causes tumors on the nervous system when it goes wrong. So if one of your copies, you've got two copies, one from your mother, one from father. If one goes wrong, you end up with this disorder, neurofibromatosis type 1. And I had to practice that. That leads to tumors, which can be on the face, disfiguring, can be in organs, critical organs, and therefore stop the organs working, which isn't really good. So the focus has been heavily on these tumours for the very good reason. But it also impacts a whole lot of cognitive things, those things I mentioned before. So Andrea had been working with Dr. Vincent Riccardi, or Vic, who is the one who named the protein that goes with it and everything. He's just died a few weeks ago, but the foremost world authority on this gene. And in 2018, he noticed with a team of researchers that the impact on music is massive. So amusia, which is where you can't even tell tones apart. I mean, I'm really bad at music, but I don't have amusia. I can recognise Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. People with amusia can't recognise simple tunes. Depending on what research you read, it's somewhere between 1.5 and 4% of the population. Of the NF1 population, it's 67%. And yet this is a massively long gene, 300,000 bases, and only one base going wrong will cause the disorder because it'll mess up the protein. So the impact on music alone is massive. And there's no other gene that we know that does this, but it links to those other components we're talking about. So that led Vic, and then working with Andrea, to really question how important these cognitive impacts are and what that tells us about what the gene does when it's working properly. And the big question, because Andrea is the one in 2018 who discovered that the NF1 gene, our human one, is unique. It is one base different from the chimpanzees. So we're looking at all the things that this gene impacts, but chimpanzees can't do. And that tells us what this gene's involved in. So the focus then became on the cognitive stuff and the big question, why would evolution leave in a gene that causes this fairly traumatic disorder in 1 in every 3,000 births? So we're talking about a huge cohort of people worldwide with it. Why would it not only leave the gene in, but make it so successful that it spread to all humans for whom we have DNA? So that's Denisovans, who we only know existed, but importantly, Neanderthals and us all have a double dose, the whole worldwide. Evolution doesn't do that for no reason.
Mm. Well, that's interesting because when we think about reason, then that almost makes us want to anthropomorphize.
Absolutely.
And so, why is that a
It's an
danger?
easy way to talk about it rather than,
Right.
get
But
all technical.
but do we really mean that nature has reasons for doing things in the sense that it has a goal other than, say, survival? And even then, that seems to me tricky and getting into philosophical waters rather than scientific
Yeah,
ones.
and I'm not good at philosophical waters, but I don't think it has a goal as much as statistical. Um, so what will have happened over 500,000 years ago? I can go into the details if you want them, but they're all in the book.
Mm,
Over 500,000 years ago, one of our ancestors, not Homo sapiens, got one mutation in this gene. Now, this gene mutates quite, if 1 in 3,000 births, this is not unusual. In the chimp-like version, that one mutation spread slowly, of course, being
mm,
evolution, but it should have been wiped out. Things that mess people up or species up are usually gradually worked out. But there must be a reason this one was so successful that it had everywhere except despite the cost.
mm.
And that's the question that's been asked by the researchers into this gene for decades, including Vic at conferences. Why? What did it offer that's such a benefit?
Mm.
And it's what it offered for memory systems, for knowledge systems, allowing humans to be the only species that can store information and adapt the way humans have.
So, what's at stake then when you talk about the way that we've offloaded information onto structures like a henge or Stonehenge? I'm not even sure really what the henge part of Stonehenge means, but you talk about other henges. What's at stake if we can say with 100% certainty or very close to it that that's what those devices were, and what does it tell us that we should, how we should maybe interact with the world now?
I think I'm going to have to go back a little bit to
Sure.
put that question in context. A henge is a Neolithic monument that has a ditch and bank around it.
Mm.
And some insist on defining which side the bank is of the ditch, and Stonehenge doesn't work, but it doesn't matter. What I've shown going back 70,000 years, Stonehenge and the henges are only about 5,000 years ago. What I've shown going back 70,000 years is that this use of music, of sound, but what comes out stronger in the archaeology is the use of space. So this gene hits our spatial, when it goes wrong, hits spatial abilities very hard.
Mm.
So let's look then at the spatial abilities and what I mean by that, which includes art, but also memory palaces. And in Indigenous terms, Australian Indigenous terms, songlines, which is, since we've last talked, I've had 2 books come out jointly with Margot Neal, my Indigenous co-author, called Songlines. Okay, let's think. I'm just getting some props here. I
Okay.
always have my props. Okay, animals some will take a twig maybe and strip it off and use it as a tool. But no other species will take a lump of rock and imagine how to get a spearhead or something and cut it, taking a lot of skill to get something that you can't see initially. So some of the earliest artwork, these are Pueblo, which is Native American culture that's really useful for this. So these are Pueblo figurines. No other species will take wood, imagine a shape, a replica of us, or in this case, one of the Kachina, one of the characters. So your memory people will recognize the use of characters makes things memorable.
Right.
So they create a pantheon of characters and they'll carve them and paint them out of wood. No other species does anything like that. Or take clay and create characters. Now, this one is a woman with children. So any archaeologist will tell you it's a fertility figure, but it isn't. That's our Western culture always takes women, including women with saggy breasts and things. There's still Venus figures and fertility. She's a storyteller because stories are the way information is stored. So you think I've lost Stonehenge somewhere there, don't you?
No, no.
So that spatial ability, the ability to associate information with physical places, is the way Indigenous cultures work the world over when they don't use writing. So Aboriginal songlines, they associate information with different places in the landscape and can store vast amounts of information. And we have stories that go back well over 10,000 years from here. And in the book, I also work with Tlingit, T-L-I-N-G-I-T, Elder Dave Kanosh, who do exactly the same thing. Now, there's no contact between Australian Aboriginal and Native American Tlingit. They're using it because that's the way the brain works. So if the landscape is, or country as it's referred to here with a capital C, once it's used this way, has all these stories and knowledge embedded in it on which survival depends, what happens when they start to settle? It is absolutely essential not to lose that memory palace. Mm. And so they build memory palaces. And you've got to look at Stonehenge over its 1,500 years of use. It starts off, there's a cursus, there's Stonehenge cursus, which is a great long enclosure. Then you get the circle of timbers or stones, but they think they're the blue stones. What is in your head when you think Stonehenge, the great big sarsens in the middle, come 500 years after the original ditch and henge and circle. So what's happening is as they're settling, they're increasing basically a memory palace. Mm. But to show that, you need all the other aspects of a knowledge system. So when they put the big sarsens in, that makes it very restricted, and that's how you get secure information, by restricting knowledge. And the acoustics are really strong. So you're going to get all sorts of acoustic effects. And at the same time, so that's a restricted site now, at the same time they build Durrington walls down the road, which I can go on to for ages. But if I'm right, you must have objects like this, except they're more, I haven't got a British one, but this is an Aboriginal stone, Coolamon.
Is that a Coolamon? Yeah.
Gene allows us to take wood and create shapes by imagining it and rotating it. On the back are what appear to be abstract symbols. Mm. And a girl using this food dish will learn the songs, music, story, associated with each one of those, which will also be associated with part of the country. So you're using all those things together and creating these artworks. So at Stonehenge, you have the Stonehenge plaques, which are chalk plaques with the abstract. So you can see all of this, the public and restricted, the music, sound, art, it's all put together to optimize memorizing vast amounts of information. Now, Stonehenge is only 5,000 years old, and this works right around the world on monuments the world wide, only in that transition phase, and then they're abandoned. And Stonehenge is only 5,000 years old. We have the stories here and the Tlingit do that are over 10,000 years old. So unless the Brits were sort of way, way behind intellectually our cultures here, 300 or so cultures here, and all the Native American, I know the African and Pacific use the same methods, then unless they were that backward, they were using these methods as well, and everything at the henges and other monuments around the world indicate that's exactly what they were doing. It's the human brain.
Well, I did some homework, coincidentally, not purposely, but just a few weeks before I heard about the Knowledge Gene coming out, Auntie Jude Hammond had a Coolamon course here in the Sunshine Coast, and so I made one. And, you know, this is not exactly it's not like the Coolamon you just showed, but when I was making it, two things sort of came that surprised me. The first is I thought I could make one that is sort of like my foot, so that when I use it as a memory palace, I could refer not just to the object, but also to my foot. So I had that in mind as I was shaping it. And Auntie Jude Hammond, she just said, she sort of had this like minimal instruction kind of thing. Just kind of go wild. Here's what a Coolmon is. Now make it. But the other thing that was surprised me while we were doing it is that we had these strings with beads on both sides, wooden beads that were used to like cut the clay. And I just like instinctually just put these beads into the shape so that I could later have this string, not just that I could maybe hang this, but that I could use this as an additional memory palace element. So like I've already worked
Exactly.
out multiple ways to have many stations on this, and I scratched on the surface here various shapes and so forth, which also is just sort of like this instinctual thing to do. I'm not sure yet how those scratches will be useful at all. But anyway, I'm going to paint it later. But that was the two main things. It's like I can make this like my foot, and I could use the tools that I'm using it for. I could actually build them into the thing, and then have these strings be an additional, not a song line as such, but like a path
Well,
that I
it
can
is a miniature
feel.
songline.
Okay.
It functions in the same way. So what is interesting, what you just said about you built that in, is every one of these is unique. So let's go to Africa. Uh, this is a model of an African Lukasa, and you're talking about beads and things.
Mm,
Is
right.
that in focus?
Yep.
There are none in Australia, and I have adapted this from one I held in America. Do you get an emotional reaction to your Coolamon?
Yeah, even just holding it now, I mean, I can
And
remember the name of the instructor even better just holding it,
yeah,
more
that's
meaningful.
what happens with me. And as a foundation member of the Australian Skeptics, and I was told when I was given this um, guardianship of it, you can't own these objects. This one's well over 100 years old from Central Desert. When Nungarai gave me guardianship, she said the old people had asked because she wants me to talk. They want me to talk like this. And my skeptic brain said, oh, yeah. And I still get an emotional reaction every time,
Mm.
whether it's spirituality or not. I don't know.
Yep.
That's not my field. I'm a scientist. But um, the African equivalent is Lukasa from the Luba people of West Africa. And I've set this one up for my own stuff, but it's held like that. And you had the shape that makes it easier to hold.
Mm.
And they tell the stories associated with each bead on it,
Right.
and vast amounts of information. And the back, which is tortoiseshell, because it looks like they're the same, but they're not because of the position
Mm.
when you hold, and you can't help doing that because it makes it nice and smooth. So these beads and shells were put on. Well, I didn't believe when I first heard about these, read the research. So I grabbed it. And like you, I didn't in advance work out what I was going to do with it, just checking I've got the right way up. And I encoded the 412 birds of Victoria to this. So each bead is a family, and then there's a story. And I've turned the birds into characters, which is exactly what we do in memory competitions and all memory stuff. Add character, add emotion. I also sing
Mm.
that sequence in the shower when no one can hear me, given it's painful to other people. And that's what we've got to stop people saying, I cannot sing. Musicians, music is only for those guys out there that are really good at music. Art is only for those who are really good at it. It's not. This gene shows you we are all encoded to use these things. And I didn't know what I was going to encode, and it still works really well. I am astonished how well it works, and
Mm.
so are the many people who have made them. So our brains are set up to use memory palaces in miniature or in grandiose format.
Mm.
And now we know this. Let me get across now, it's not a single gene theory. No gene works by itself. This gene supercharges these skills, links them, and clearly is really valuable because of these skills. But there are sure to be other genes involved.
Mm. Well, I'm glad you mentioned skepticism. I didn't know there was such a group. I maybe have to try to get in there because I'm a skeptic myself, and I have these wild experiences all the time, and I try not to make too much of them. But you talk in the book about, how we discount ancient cultures as being not scientific.
Mm.
And I wonder, like, it feels to me like this is a very slippery thing, what it is to be scientific, because there's falsifiability, which,
Exactly.
is such a interesting concept. And I think Popper said, like, even falsifiability has to be held to the standard of falsifiability, which is a bit problematic because you can't do it. You don't have enough time to do all the tests that would allow you to falsify falsifiability, right? But I think he was worried that it would become political if you didn't hold falsifiability to itself. But I just wonder, like, are they really being scientific? Or are we getting ourselves into hot water when we say, well, they were being scientific, as opposed to something more like proto-scientific, or giving us the gift of the science that we have landed on by evolving it? Because I don't know if it's quite right to say, well, they were being scientific without being anachronistic. You know what I mean? Or is there evidence that they literally had a scientific method, and maybe they just thought about metaphorical truth in a particular way, and they let certain things slide that were obviously not true, but and I mean, they is already a problematic thing because we've got so many different cultures to talk about. But do you know what I'm trying to get at? There's just this, it seems to me there's a bit of a problem with just the word science, period.
I
And then,
don't think there's
and
any
that,
problem whatsoever, and I have no doubt they, going back tens of thousands of years, were heavily scientific.
Mhm.
We have cases in ancient caves, 40,000 years ago I need to get which cave right, but in Europe, where they were creating colors by heating particular, I can get you the exact formula, heating it, adding something else in, then heating it again to thousands of degrees to get a brighter white. And they were doing it repeatedly and bringing in the materials from a distance. Now, science to me is observing, testing, making sure it works, and therefore testing for falsibility. Huge amounts of Indigenous knowledge is scientific. It has to be. They wouldn't have survived.
Right.
So Indigenous astronomy, if you look at Dwayne Hammaker's book, The First Astronomers, their observation of the skies and also things like scintillation around the stars indicating weather conditions, which they would have tested over and over and over and refined with time. How is that not science? There's medical books now of hundreds of pages of Indigenous medical treatments, which is including binding bones and using particular plants like datura is a hallucinogen, but it's used as an anesthetic. This is all documented, but the only way you can get this documentation is elders that are willing to share it, and there's all sorts of restricted problems, linguists who actually are strong enough in both whatever language you're translating into and the Indigenous language, scientists who are strong enough to recognise, and there's problems with that, like the Hanuo of Philippines. Levi Strauss talks about the fact they had 1,200 and something species, but the biologists at the time didn't know that many species for the area, which made the translation a problem. So you've got this massive knowledge, but we want the exotic. It's been up till very recently that Indigenous cultures were looked at what is different and what's exotic and what we can sort of see as primitive and sort of snigger at a bit from our vastly superior stage. That's a problem. No, it's definitely science, and I can give you example after example.
No, that's helpful. I mean, partly I think if we drill down into categories, that is useful to think of astronomy versus color theory, or whatever you want to call arriving at repeatable painting, actual paints.
And cycads, the cycad plant, which is up your way more than down my way, it takes at least 5 days, preferably longer treatment, going through all these processes to make it edible. If you eat it earlier, you die. I mean, you've got to wonder how they worked all this out. But by treating cycads in advance, the Indigenous people of the area could run these great big ceremonies and gatherings and feed huge numbers of people on what is a deadly plant and not kill anyone. So these things are stored in songs and story. They are scientific recipes, methods, testable.
Right. Yeah, you have to wonder how many poor people died to figure that out, but before they observe it.
Suggest that it's more enemies died in the testing.
Oh, really? Say more.
That's what I don't know for sure. Certainly people will have died by eating the wrong thing, but how they worked out, I don't know.
Right. Okay. I think I can imagine a certain.
That is one hypothesis I've read.
Okay. This reminds me of something Tyson Yunkaporta talks about in Sand Talk, which is a little bit different, but he talks about how in fights, one of the things that would happen in certain situations is that the winner of the fight would have to take just as many scars as the ones that they gave, which may not relate here, but it comes to mind.
It does. I work with Tyson, and his concept of sand talk we'll get to at some stage, I hope, because that really is important. So his work is very relevant.
Yeah.
The beauty of his work too is it moves you away from this noble savage. You know, Indigenous cultures are all wonderful and we're all terrible. They're human.
Right. Well, speaking of the human, a theme that I've heard you talk about before and write about before comes up in the knowledge gene again, which, to use a word that Tyson uses, is the role of the custodian and people who are in charge of being really good at the repeatable knowledge or the scientific knowledge. And then, I don't know, like how much do we know about how they would have ushered new, can we say mnemonics, or people who memorized the material to become the next custodians who were able to not only remember it, but validate that other people knew it so that they could help continue the knowledge and make sure it was correct.
I think we've got to move away from the idea that all Indigenous people are the same. And this is a question that arose as a result of the question, why did evolution leave in this gene? Just because some of the research pointed out some autistic and ADHD type characteristics, I started asking, why did evolution leave autism right across all human populations, autism spectrum, and it's on a spectrum and genetically driven, but certainly not a single gene or even identifiable yet which genes, left ADHD right across all populations, and we'll get to dyslexia in a moment, aphantasia that I have. So if you're thinking about the people repeating information, keeping it accurate, these stories that go back 10,000 years of, landscape changes and volcano things, eruptions, and this is testable too, because the stories of volcano eruptions in Australia date back to around 60, 70,000 years. Where there are volcano eruptions before that, there are no stories. So it's not that they're creating new stories by identifying those places. These stories accurately represent what happened. Dwayne in First Astronomers talks about the way stars like Pleiades is always described as 7, but actually if you look at it now, it's only 6 stars. But back when the stories originated, you could see 7. So we've got these old stories. We need people who don't like change, who will repeat the information, who will focus on particular information and different ones. So we need to think in terms of diverse populations. So if you've got about 100 people in, just to make the figures easy, in a band of people way back when they were moving out of Africa, adapting to environments everywhere, you need people on the autism spectrum, because if that information is not kept accurate, you just ate the cycads again and died. But these are performance-based knowledge systems, music, art, performance, all performance also affected by this gene. And so you need the people who are really active, who are taking in absolutely everything, or else we can't adapt. So you need those on the ADHD type spectrum again, performing stuff and taking in masses of information. And then you've got, well, if there is such a thing as neurotypical, but you've got other people saying, oh, that's useful, and it eventually ends up over there. And I've discussed this with Margot Neal at length. So that diversity is built into all human populations globally. So it's genetically, biologically driven. So we need the autistic spectrum type behaviours. We need the ADHD type behaviours. And so it's that combination that is enabling humans to store vast amounts of information. But since literacy, which I get to towards the end of the book, we all sit still and learn one way, and otherwise it's a disorder. Diversity that has served humans for 99% of our existence is now sidelined as a problem. So then you take dyslexia. It was really depressing interviewing all the dyslexics that I interviewed for the book, because they invariably told me how they were told they were dumb as children, not only by teachers and fellow students, but often by their parents, and that they were disappointing. Why couldn't they learn to read and so on? The research is very robust that dyslexics have very strong spatial abilities. So their abilities to create these objects, to use memory palaces, to navigate is way, way stronger. So you'll find dyslexia very strong in architecture and art in particular. So if your architect can't spell, that's why. And they don't get lost navigating. So we were dependent on them and their advanced skills as well. And unfortunately, we have sidetracked that. But I've used memory palaces with dyslexic kids in schools, especially one girl with a really low self-esteem. She was convinced she was dumb compared to everybody else and was being told that, not, I'm pleased to say, by her teachers or parents. Use a memory palace, she absolutely flew, and she couldn't work out why everybody else wasn't moving as fast and could use it as valuably as she. We set up one right around the school, and her mind would just go the location so easily because her brain's set up that way. So evolution has carefully shoved these differences in, because as a population, evolution doesn't care about individuals. They'll sacrifice some of people with tumours, they'll sacrifice other people, as long as the population benefits. So I've got dyslexia, and it's talked about a lot on the memory forums, and that I have no visual imagery. So if I think of my parents' faces, I see nothing, just grey mush. So memory is, that's why I end up in this. How does everybody?
This is aphantasia, not dyslexia.
Aphantasia, yes. Aphantasia. Yeah, I've changed again. No, dyslexics, they may have aphantasia as well, but probably not. It's why I got into this whole music memory thing in the first place, because I couldn't work out why everybody else's memories were so much better than mine. So why would evolution ever, and it's 4% or so across the whole population worldwide, again, biologically driven. But the recent research shows that we don't get post-traumatic stress because we can't relive past events. So as far as my husband's concerned, there's no point taking me anywhere because I'll have forgotten it in a year's time. So my memory is really poor. I can't, they say in memory palaces, use your childhood home. Yeah, wonderful. I can't imagine my childhood home. I can't do it that way. So, but the advantage to having a few in our population who are like me is that if a traumatic event happens to the population, a war and stuff, which is going to happen, wild animals attack and kill half of them or something, my lot will be just as upset initially, but we'll recover very quickly and we won't be affected by it in the long term anywhere near as much. So evolution has done this beautiful trick of putting it all in, and we're carefully sidelining them all out of education.
Yeah. There's like so many things now I want to ask, but let me try to grab on something. You said that there are people who we need people who don't like to change.
Yep.
And I'm not a political person or anything like that, but there were a few comments about conservatives in the book. And not being a conservative myself, I don't know what I am. If anything, I'm a yo-yo, right? Like, oh, well, it's convenient to have this idea today, so that's the one I'll have. And I'm quite aware of that, right? So I'm not really political at all. But I had this feeling of like, well, if we need people who don't like change, that is what conservatism is in the Berkeley sense, and very much so in political
Mm.
theory, right? Is we have something to conserve, we have something to preserve. And then I'm thinking as I'm reading The Knowledge Gene, well, maybe I am a conservative because I want to conserve things, and I'm going to go somewhere, and I need you to help me.
I'm scared that you're mixing up conservatism and autism spectrum.
No, I think I
No.
probably I was diagnosed as a kid as being on spectrum, this, that. I have many several diagnoses over my years. So you'll have to be patient if I'm misusing terms like conservatism and so
No.
forth. But I'm going somewhere, and I really want your opinion on this because I can't think of anyone else I would want to ask other than you. But there are comments about, they're very slight and subtle. But I think as a person who has done this, like, this is really now just, if I ever, heaven forbid, I ever have to get a job, like, I feel like I'll just hand this as my resume, right? Because this explains why I'm this crazy person who jumped out of a parachute or a plane without a parachute 14 years ago, started a memory business, and, is willing to have my face all over the place because,
How did you not die?
well, no, I'm being metaphorical. And I want to ask you about metaphor and
Oh,
abstract.
phew.
When I became a quote unquote entrepreneur, right? I literally jumped out of a plane. Like, I have no plan B. I have no pension coming. I have nothing, right? And I've been able to do this successfully for 14 years. So I'm definitely on some kind of spectrum. The thing that, and forgive me if this takes a few sentences, but I want to ask you something that I think is really, really important right now that relates to a lot of what you're talking about in the Knowledge Gene. And this idea of people who don't like change, because I don't like change. I work on the internet, and right now, 2024, September 4th, we now have insight into what Google is doing. And you mentioned being quite willing to speculate sometimes in the Knowledge Gene. And I want to get you to speculate about something. I have to, in order to survive with this magnetic Mary method project, I have to willingly delete stuff from my website, or Google is going to deprecate me. And I was and it's already, like, there are many, many websites that have lost more than half of the traffic. They've lost sometimes all of the traffic because Google is making changes to their search algorithms. Now, I was feeling quite negative about this until I read The Knowledge Gene, and then I'm just thinking, well, hang on a second. If it is, you talk about this, like, knowledge is being updated. Humans,
Oh.
they are changing. Stonehenge was this way, and then it was that way. And there's chalk maybe that they were using on Stonehenge. So my umbrage and my conservatism, I'll just call it that, even though I don't mean it necessarily politically, my resistance to change from before I read The Knowledge Gene to after, I feel much more empathetic to a giant corporation forcing myself and millions of other people with websites to delete content because they're going to write us off the map if we have irrelevant content that they no longer deem useful. Now, I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but what I'm saying is I'm a little bit more comfortable with it, and I wonder if I can ask you to speculate a little bit about that, because it seems like a fundamental human behavior that they may be using a search engine as the extension of what it is to be human, to deprecate knowledge that they no longer think is useful in order to have a better internet. Because I don't think they're necessarily doing it for nefarious reasons, even though there is some of that. But it's an issue that I face. And I literally today, before we talked, I'm redirecting pages like this. And I can be honest, like, there's a lot of crap on my site. So I'm not totally unhappy to redirect it. But where I was unhappy is I'm also undoing history. I had written this. This is what I thought at a time. And I would love to have the freedom to not be penalized by a corporation for having had a thought 12 years ago or whatever. But at the same time, I can recognize, especially after reading this, well, they had chalk on Stonehenge for a reason. And we do update stuff all the time. So maybe it's not all that bad. And it you actually saved me from another 3 weeks of a bad attitude as I'm deleting stuff from my website. But you know what I'm saying? It's just, I'm reading there's this little comment about conservatives, and I'm like, but I am conservative. Like, I want to conserve everything on my site, and I want conservatives to win I don't really want them to win I don't really care because it's politics world. But it would be nice if a government would say to Google, no, 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 you have to fix your algorithm so that people aren't running around by the millions deleting stuff that should be archived.
Can I suggest you archive it to your own hard drive and backup system?
Oh yeah, that's all covered.
Good. So it's not lost. It's
Well,
just
it is lost though, because you can't search it if that the website is directed. It's lost to the global community, not to me personally.
And there is evidence going back tens of thousands of years that humans have always done this. So if you look at Aboriginal sites, you'll see that the artwork isn't good. Let's do a pretty artwork and leave it. It's updated constantly. So sites up in Northern Territory that date back 30,000 years of continuous art will have Europeans arriving with guns. So information has to be updated and current because humans have to survive on what they know best now. So you've got that evidence. The beautiful cave art in the European rock art caves, that's not all done at once. And what happens, you think of that, you think of the bisons and the beautiful horse heads and things, but all around it is abstract art because some artists were great, most weren't, but they were all in a position and it was constantly updated. So there'll be images over other ones. So yes, humans have been doing this forever. The beauty of abstract art, something like that, is that you can change the meanings as things change, whereas stuff that's representative, you can't do that as easily. So I'm sorry, but that's the way humans do. We have our limits in information and we need what is most relevant. I do mention politics briefly. Both my publishers, it's published by Allen Unwin here, Greystone Books, publishing for North America, they're Canadian, for North America in April. And in Zoom sessions, they were talking about how much politics I was going to put in, and they were quite willing for me to put quite a lot more in. But for me, there's two massive issues facing us at the moment. And one is climate change and the other's inequality. And I think you can link almost everything else to those two. Unless humans adapt the way we have for our entire history, we're not going to deal with them. But I just described this population that was dependent on artists and musicians and autistic, and where in your politics are those people? There are no people that show autistic or ADHD, maybe a little bit on, but not the extremes of ADHD. You will not get people, there are artists and musicians, they're not there. And the experience of writing this book was really weird. At the table I'm sitting at now, we would often have a whole group of people, including a couple of musicians, a couple of artists, Tavish, who is the autistic birder in the book. And I'd make a statement on what I was working on at the time, thinking, I know how you're going to respond, and nothing was predictable. Their brains worked so differently. Jane Rusden's an artist, but also dyslexic in the book, and she's also dyslexic in real life. I would put down a picture of rock art and ask her what she saw, and I saw the horse heads. She saw the shapes of the rock and how they must have related to the way she was seeing and interpreting it completely different. We're talking about a photo in a book. And that was a real shock to me. So now going back to politics, humans have adapted because evolution deliberately made a diverse population. And what we've done is eliminated anything but one narrow way of thinking, and they run all the corporations and the politics. I don't think we can adapt to the problems as long as that's there. And I don't see a solution, I'm afraid, yet. We'll work on it.
Yeah. I don't know. Anyway, thank you for letting me rehearse that because it is a point of anxiety for me, especially as someone who cares about memory. And yes, I have my own archive, but it's not the same as being able to search it. But one thing I've thought about, and I don't know it for sure, and some other people have written about this, so it's not even an idea I had myself, but I thought about it after I read it, is that companies like Google, they can no longer afford the energy costs of having the search tools crawl the entire internet. So that's part of what they're doing. They're trying to conserve energy consumption, which has a huge cost. So I just add that little angle, and now we can get back to cool stuff. But anyway, thank you.
Well, that's exactly what memory is. So the memory is a communal memory, has a limit. Well, we don't know what that limit is, but you've certainly got to limit it. So it was essential that in the performances, the ceremonies, which were where information was exchanged and made memorable, there's a limit. So it's exactly the same thing. There's a limited amount of energy in performance, in recalling. And so humans have always had to limit the information to what is relevant. It's who decides what's relevant. That's the question.
Yeah, well, that could be more grumbling from me because obviously I'm biased towards memory being the most important thing.
Oh, it is, without doubt.
Yeah, well,
it is our identity. Everybody's identity is tuned to their memory and what they know. And it's interesting if you look at dementia, people that are completely non-responsive normally will respond to music. The research is huge on that. Because it's ingrained so deeply. And this is a very, very old gene. It's a supergene because it's actually a whole collection of genes that are now inherited always together because it's so old and they've been inherited together for so long. So if you take people with extreme dementia to places that are familiar or play music that's familiar, they will respond. And that shows just how critical memory palaces and places and music, art and objects are to memory and to identity.
Yeah,
as a population as well as individuals.
Some years ago, when I first heard about people with dementia being given access to music again and saw a documentary where their faces just come to life when they have music, I immediately went and got inserted into my will. This will be the music that you play for me if I'm ever in such a situation, because I want to have that.
What a good idea!
Yeah, a little power tip.
I'm going to do that.
Yeah. I just hope that I still like the music that I wrote in there.
That's an interesting point because my tastes in music are changing. And I'm not sure what's happening because of a dear friend, Jackie Dark, the opera singer who's quoted in the book and who died last October. I started doing opera just because she wanted to, and I knew I hated opera, but let's be nice to Jackie. And she said, stick to Mozart, don't do Wagner, stick to Mozart and Verdi. So I got the magic flute, and it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be, but there were some screechy women in it. So I sped through the Queen of the Night and the three women, the screechy women. And eventually I decided I had to face screeching. Now that is my favourite music of everything. The Queen of the Night arias, I just can't get anything that comes close. Yet I would have told you 5 years ago that I hate it. So what's happening to my brain in terms of music that my tastes are changing?
Well,
that's for you to answer because I don't know.
I think you do have the answer in the book. I think you mentioned it only once, but I'm glad you raised this because I was going to ask you about music and this word. And I might be wrong, just to say here's the answer, but I think it is neurogenesis. I think you mentioned neurogenesis once, and I was going to share with you a similar experience I've had. So I was doing some research in what's called black metal, which is very discordant usually. And there's a book by an Australian named Bill Peel called Tonight It's a World We Bury. And he's talking about why is it that black metal has all this discordance, noise, distortion, screaming like demons and all this stuff. Like, why are people doing this? And so I started to listen to this music very intensely. And I think that probably there is a neurogenesis component to it, because after I didn't time it and I didn't make a calendar, but after a certain point, this switch happened. And now I can't get enough of it. And I wonder if, as I'm studying it, I'm thinking, okay, so here's some maximum angularity, and there's a little bit of limited hexaphonic transpositions, and like all this music theory stuff. All of a sudden, when I can make, even Beethoven's Für Elise has what's called maximum angularity in it, right? And that is one of the premises of how black metal works, is just that maximum angularity between two notes and playing them at the same time. Anyway, the point is then when the connection comes, I'm probably fantasizing that I can feel neurogenesis happening, but the insight leads to a love of something that I thought was hideous before. And now, like I say, I can't get enough of this black metal stuff.
And our stories couldn't, I mean, black metal and opera aren't the same, although at times you might.
They are. So Satyricon has at the opera, and they have opera playing the I think it's Sweden or Norway. Sorry, it's the Norway Sweden opera or Norway opera doing black metal with them with opera, and they're not doing the same music. It's opera doing opera and or choral. I'll send you the link later.
Yeah.
Maybe you can't listen to much of it long, but probably if you listen to it for 4 weeks and you read a book about black metal, you'll be into it.
This was one of the things with both when I do the chapters on art and music that go back great distances. If this gene is so important, I have to show that these particular skills or ways we use them are ancient, innate, they're born into us and biological, that they are universal, every single culture, that they are uniquely human and so important that evolution put them in. And with music, it was that universal I had a problem with. And uniquely human. And the universal, I kept saying, but Chinese music doesn't sound anything like our music. But I got onto some good research on that too. And all music, now I'd love to know whether your black metal does it, uses a perfect fifth. So if there's a scale in there, the first to the fifth note in the scale is in the ratio of 3:2. And it's universal, all Indigenous music, Western music, everything. And there's other universalities. Rhythm is a key one, but also there's entrainment. And this is what is uniquely human. Insects are the only other species that do it. That's me in training. Entrainment means lining up rhythms. So birds will do some things musically, don't learn as much and adapt as much. Whales will create songs, learn and adapt and teach, but they don't entrain. They don't line up their rhythms. Insects line up their rhythms, don't do the other stuff. We do it all and put it together. And that entrainment, and that seems to lead to a human bonding and an emotional response to music, especially to doing music with others that no other species does. And that's something I talked in earlier books about music being invaluable for memory. It's invaluable for a lot more for this population of ours adapting everywhere. It identifies your group. So if you think military music compared to, rock music or whatever, we will rock you. I wasn't allowed to put in that in the book, it costs too much. But if you think of the Hallelujah chorus, which I end up using instead, if I sit here and go, hallelujah, 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 Lord God, hallelujah, you're going to be bored out of your mind awfully quickly. Give me a choir and an orchestra and you're going to pay me to come and hear it. And that's what music does. It bonds, it teaches, it does so many things, and it's universal and uniquely human. So I think it'd be really interesting to compare opera and black metal and just see what it's doing to the human brain, because the role of music. So what do we do in schools? We have little kids learning the alphabet, singing it, and then music becomes a hobby class on the side. Whereas in Indigenous cultures, it's in the heart, and it becomes the class only for those who are really talented at it. The same with art. With computing, when it came in, I taught computing and stuff as well as physics and maths, things that I could cope with without a memory. We had those who are really good at it do computer studies, but everybody learns it and it's part of everything. I want to see the same with art and music. I want to see them at the launch, the GP who launched the book had the whole audience up singing a little dance for the formula for kinetic energy equals half mv squared. And the whole audience were doing, that's the end of it, the squared. It's so simple. I've got examples galore of that sort of thing. So this music, there is something in our brains that really responds to it, and we're not taking advantage of that to anywhere near its full potential. And there are no musicians, Peter Garrett, I think, is the only one, didn't last long, in politics.
Oh, from Midnight Oil.
Yeah, he was in politics for a while.
Right.
So when they talk diversity, they talk women or people who are black and white or gay and not. That's not what I'm talking about with diversity. We need cognitive diversity, like I had around the kitchen table with this book, and we need it in politics and we need it in business.
Yeah, that's such tricky stuff. It almost seems like it's become that, you know, people who do music and art and so forth, they just can't be bothered with what has become a game of yes, sir, and how high do you want me to jump in order for me to continue getting the funding? That, you know,
I think that, and there you just hit it. Musicians and artists I talk to, their value system doesn't put money first. Everyone in politics talks money, 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 especially American politics, where wealth and success is measured on wealth. That mindset is a very narrow mindset, yet I can't see getting into politics otherwise, the way our system's set up.
Yeah,
I think they need my kitchen table as a metaphor. Please don't bring them all here. I think, and there's an ABC show where they have autistic people asking questions. I think if they could start bringing in those sorts of tables rather than the influencers who can buy stuff who all think the same as well.
It'd just be so deadly and dangerous to have people actually say what they think, right? Which doesn't
and
let
to
you
think
package and control.
differently.
Right, yeah.
Yes, control. I think that's a key word to it as well.
Yeah.
We can change the world, Anthony.
Well, I think that we, especially you, have done great things. I mean, people love your books. I mean, it's always wonderful to see the enthusiasm that people bring to it. And to me, that is change, and it passes forward. So I think we can. I think we are changing the world, and your work is always incredibly inspiring, and I was grateful for it. Do we have time for...
I'm dependent on people like you letting people know my work exists. Otherwise it disappears, never to be seen again.
Well, I mean, this is kind of the question with, you know, updating websites and so forth. And I need people like you to be able to have things to talk about so that I can, you know, link things better and always try to conceive like what's going to work on Google. And, you know, it may be that Google gets broken up and then it becomes a different game, but it's still going to need some sort of incentives, which kind of comes back to things like neurogenesis or dopamine and all that sort of stuff. Is like, I can only do it because it works.
We just got back to the fact that it's not an individual that works. We need populations with different skills in order to gain change.
Well, do you have time for some more questions? Because you mentioned metaphor.
I've got all the time in the world. I'll talk about this forever.
Well, that's what we need too, right? Because we love it, and that's the first and foremost artistic test or music test or intellectual test or whatever you want to call it. But you mentioned metaphor, and I wanted to ask you about metaphor because there's something that comes up about the difference between abstraction or abstract information and then metaphorical information, and we already went through the science stuff. But the thing that I was thinking about metaphor versus abstraction, since that you mentioned Asian material so much, I wonder about Zen. That was the first thing that came to my mind, because Zen seems to me metaphor and abstraction at the same time. And one passage that came to my mind was In the Blue Cliff Record, there's this wonderful passage, and it says, a student came to a monk and said, give me an example of an enlightened person. And the monk said, two eyes and a skull. To me,
I
that's
love it.
abstract and metaphor at the same time. And it's a very concrete metaphor, but it's also pretty abstract, but maybe concretely abstract. I don't know. But I mean, what were you thinking when you were talking about abstract information and then metaphor? Can we unwind the?
And that's another thing that this gene impacts when people with NF1, with neurofibromatosis, do take things very literally. That is partly what headed us down the autistic spectrum area. So the ability to use metaphor, which saves energy, back to what you're on about. So if I say it was a eureka moment for me, that only means something to me within my own culture, but I just saved a great long explanation. It's an energy-saving device, but it requires imagination and it requires story and narrative. And that's something that, to the best of our knowledge, only humans do, but it's certainly impacted by this gene. So the gene is shining a light on this combination of things. So metaphor is something we use huge amounts, and Indigenous cultures use a lot more than we do because they're not writing things down. So anything that makes effective storage, efficient storage, will be used. Metaphors are invaluable in language, but they are culturally dependent. The use of metaphor is universal. The actual metaphors are culturally dependent.
Right.
So with art, it's really interesting. I'm obsessed with the whole thing of art. If you go back to early rock art, if you look at the Chinese rock art and the rock art, now we'll get to panels and Asian stuff. And in North America and here, you'll have trouble telling it apart, telling which is which. But if you look at contemporary Asian art and contemporary, other art, you can tell the difference. It's cultural. But if you look at children, they all start out, it's innate, they all do it. But they'll start it very similarly, and then it'll become culturally dependent. But what's fascinating about the rock art is it's always in panels, great long panels of symbols, some of the really beautiful stuff, but mostly abstract symbols. So they're blackboards. The longest that I know of in the world is 6 Mile Canyon in Utah, which is 72 kilometers long. 72 kilometers of rock art continuous. It's a massive blackboard. So if you look at China, which, as you'll know from the book, I'm a little bit obsessed by, but it's the only culture in the world we can take from 40,000-year-old rock art right through the way the script developed to a script used today. And they went from these great long rock art panels to the scrolls, great long scrolls, and then to images like Hokusai, the wave guy, who coined the term manga, and into manga and cartoons. So you've got this continuous from these great long storytelling memory devices. And you mentioned Tyson Yunkaporta and sand talk before. That sand talk that's drawn in the ground as the stories are told is exactly the same thing again. It's the way our spatial minds work, and we store information that way. So some of the Chinese narrative scrolls, 5-6 meters long, telling stories is the way our brains are set up to do. I've now done this with workshops with teachers and kids, just getting them to plonk each aspect of the topic on a scroll, on a continuum. And there they've got the most wonderful memory device, and the brain responds, but each one will do it slightly differently. So this is what Margot Neal, my co-author on Songlines, talks about with performance in art, music, anywhere, is the skeleton of the human body is the same for everyone. That's the information. It has to be kept accurate. The flesh we put on it is individual, making it more memorable and making it more emotional, your emotional connection to your own Coolamon, and making each one different, more entertaining and individual. That's a metaphor. that's obvious the world over.
Mm.
And we should be using it in schools. Everybody should be making pull-em-on
Yeah.
memory boards. And that's what was really very moving for me when Dave Kanosh, the Klingit elder, made memory boards. He was doing it because his grandparents had taught him how to do it. And he thought it was them. They were elders too. And he's discovered that other elders were also doing it. So they're reconstructing these methods now and working with the Southeast Alaska Heritage Institute to ensure these methods are maintained. I want to go past that. I want to see them in every school because they work a treat.
Well, about schools and what we might do to reform things or introduce new things, it doesn't necessarily have to reform. I've long had a hypothesis, which is, and I don't know if you would agree or not, but it seems slightly reflected in the book, but it's not clear to me whether the teachers that you mentioned are using the techniques themselves. Because my hypothesis is, because people say, you know, do you have anything for kids? And I do have something coming out for kids soon, but it's really for adults. It's like a Trojan horse. My hypothesis has always been that the real reform would happen only when teachers are required as part of their certification to be able to memorize 30 names in 3 minutes or less, or something like that, right? It doesn't have to be that exact number. That's like a cute way of putting it, like 30 names in 3 minutes or less, so that then it would just sort of naturally be a thing that the teachers know how to do, whatever techniques they use to do it. And then, you know, they're much more likely to be able to teach it because they actually can do it, sort of thing, and teach it well. So I don't know what you would think about that. Or is it okay for teachers to just teach it without actually validating or verifying their own skill with it? Is it a moot point, or?
I wouldn't put a time limit on it as tight as that, because I would never get to be a teacher.
Okay.
Because for me, I mean, I've trained for memory competitions and done them, but it was a lot harder for me with aphantasia. And you're talking different people, but I certainly say yes. Teaching that and expecting it in teacher training would be invaluable. Talking with teachers and schools, the cost will be zero. I mean, a school is a memory palace to glory. You've got all the grounds and built, no problems at all. Setting up these scrolls, a bit of butcher's paper will do, and then the kids film it at the end. What the problem is mindset. You're asking teachers to change the way they do things, and teachers have no spare time. They're made do so many written reports and paperwork that just about kills them. And they're working to testing methods and criteria that suit only one way of thinking. If you give teachers time and the ability to change mindset, that's where change is going to come. Yes, put it in teacher training, but that teacher is going to then get into a school full of people who did not do it that way and who think it's nuts. So we've got to go bigger than just in teacher training, but it's not a price in terms of money. It's a price in terms of thinking and time to think differently and to try it out and to start seeing their classroom as a diverse population. And teachers want to do that. I was a teacher for 40 years. What drove me out was all the paperwork and the rules and being told exactly how I had to teach, which didn't suit my personality. I'm naturally fairly theatrical. And the expectation is too much without time.
Is there maybe an incentive structure issue as well? I mean, you mentioned in the knowledge gene, and maybe I am not remembering this correctly, but if I remember correctly, you mentioned that in certain cultures at certain times, people just didn't have material incentives. They were enacting roles in society as a shared sort of survival outcome. And it wasn't like now where, okay, teaching, I could do that and I'll get summers off, that sort of thing, which is just a bad incentive to become a teacher. It doesn't mean you would be a bad teacher just because you're motivated by that incentive, but it seems like maybe that's part of the problem. And it circles back to our, let's have musicians and artists as politicians. that have a different incentive. I don't know. I'm sort of spitballing, but it seems maybe
Nobody would
that's
go
part of
into
it.
teaching summers off, recovery and preparation for the next year. You'd soon discover your summers off aren't.
Mm.
But given the pay rates and the hours, you actually work incredibly long hours during term. Nobody's going to survive with that motivation. The motivation has to be your students. And what's been taken away is time to engage with the students as individuals.
Okay.
See, in the past, any student that didn't fit the pattern, autistic kids were shoved into asylums, and that's very recent. And anyone who failed either repeated or left school young, now they're all still there, but teachers have less time in order to diversify and attend to the individuals. Now, we've got a whole lot of ideas on how to do that practically in the classroom, because there's plenty of people with theory. But once you start me on that topic, you will not shut me up. But there are lots of ways, but every last one of them depends on teachers being given time.
Mm. Yeah, the time thing is a difficult nut to
And
crack,
time is money, and off we go again. We're straight back to money.
right? Well, how do you, maybe we transition into some shop talk or shedding to talk about mnemonic technique, because you start the book with, I had all these plans to memorize all these things, and then you do all this research instead or whatnot. But like, how when you memorize, how do you get the time to do it? And given the way that you memorize with the imaging situation, how do you fit it all in? What's the sort of process? And
At my age, in my 70s, I have to stay fit. I walk my memory palaces every day. This morning I did part of my French memory palace. Mostly I do the Chinese, but I've got countries and pie and all the rest of it. So I incorporate the two of them. I sing things. Now I'm back to doing it as of the book went out yesterday, and I'm back madly memorizing again. It's fun. And that's something, you need to make it fun. You need to want to. So I'm getting sidetracked because I'm thinking about 15 different aspects of your question. Aphantasia does make visualizing a memory palace very difficult. I use story way more. The researchers that researching into aphantasia have interviewed me on this, and it seems that I do the story of my memory palace and focus on one particular aspect of it, rather than have an image of the whole thing. And when I encode, I tend to go physically to the place much more than other people need to. How do I fit it in? It's what I do. So when I'm gardening out in my memory palace, and I'll have a couple of words of vocab that I'm playing around with. But my characters, so if you take Chinese, and I've just put up a booklet about how I do Chinese, I have characters, the first letter of the words called the initials. I have a person action method for it. All characters, but I use beasts, bestiaries, because that's what was popular in medieval times, and I like animals and they give me more variety than people. So I'm often chatting away, especially my chimpanzees. My chimpanzee, for any word starting with CH in Pinyin, he chats away. He comes everywhere with me. And my little marmoset, my little monkey, he sits on my shoulder because he's little. And so these characters are there prompting me to come up with their words or whatever words I've just encoded with them. I've got an entire fantasy world, even though I can't visualize it, stories. So that's what mythology is in Indigenous cultures. It's not, there is no equivalent word in English. It's not fiction or non-fiction. It's this world we have, so how would you describe in a memory palace if you're creating an image to remember something really real? Is it fiction or non-fiction?
I've been sometimes using the word paracosm.
Oh, I like the word. I have no idea what it means.
Well, para is often like beside or above or
Yeah.
something like that. And cosm is, the space in which
Is
things
this your
exist.
own word?
No, it's actually a word that I read in the science of imagination. And they say that children who have lots of imaginary friends are developing paracosms. So I didn't invent it at all. That's an actual research
It's
word,
a
and it's 100 years
great,
old.
great, because when I did research with kids with their imaginary friends, we had 70 children from little to big. How many of you have imaginary friends? And about a quarter of the group with that. Interview them individually. Every last one does. One boy had a cat that was with him all the time. Turned out to have been a pet cat that had died when he was about 3. His parents didn't even know he remembered this cat. So these imaginary friends are everywhere.
Mm.
Once we started using them in their work, so we played with what's it called, persuasive text, where they have to make an argument. So we'd get, except we were creating friends like that, we'd get somebody else's, we called them rapscallions, we get somebody else's and shove it in front of the kid and say, now that rapscallion disagrees with you. Their arguments just became massively stronger by sticking a critter on the thing in front of them. Everybody is better at thinking that way, but we don't use it. So yes, imaginary friends are fantastic, and I love your word paracosm.
I
That's
wish
what we need.
I wish I was so clever, but it is in the research. I can send you the source later.
Yes,
I
please
I
do.
have imaginary friends at my desk all the time. This is
Yeah.
this is Edgar, and this is the evil Doctor Forget, and they're always having battles against each other. And
And
these,
do you talk to them?
well, I have them talk, and I have some stories based on them. And we made a cartoon at one point where evil Doctor Forget is trying to get Edgar to forget the word lucubration. I think it was it is to study. And in any case, I find that very, very important. And I have also a reminder on my desk all the time. This is Mr. Death, and he says, "Catch you later." So it's a.
I'm in where I write, because writing is sitting there by yourself the whole time. I have a whole stack of dolls and bears,
Mm,
and they represent every sort of aspect of my readers. But I also have French female bear and a male bear, and they're associated with anything to help me with gender.
mm.
Um, I have my Chinese ones, and I sit down and my brain starts to want to think in Chinese. It doesn't do it very well yet, but it loves it, because of their physical presences. There's so much we can do with the way the brain does that.
Mm.
And you're doing it automatically. We can do that in schools. Again, zero cost. They can either bring their imaginary friends or they can bring toys. And don't think that that's only little kids, because boys will keep it hidden, but girls will have their bears and fluffy toys. You'll often see them with fluffy toys. Um, we can use them in class. So we used to say in one class, don't put your toys away, get them out, we're going to work.
Yeah, yeah. Well, speaking of these sorts of things, you mentioned something that was quite interesting to me, where you would, if you were able to, dig a ditch in your own garden. And
I'll get my husband to. I don't want to do the
oh
work.
yes, yes. So is it
And he
Damien?
won't.
Yeah, he wouldn't dig the ditch for you. But what is it that you imagine you would do with it? Like it would become a memory palace, or is it that you wanted to test the sound bouncing if you were to recite from it, or what do you have in
This
mind?
is picking up on the henges again. So
Mm,
if you look at the henge ditches, Stonehenge one, the oldest, is about 2 meters deep, and they've all got flat bottoms. The bases are flat. Why? Defensive ditches are V-shaped, and they've all got things across, so they're not defensive. But if you look at Avebury and Durrington Walls and that, they can be up to 10 meters deep in parts and cost 1 million work hours, and that's a cost, 1 million work hours to dig. Why did they do that? Apart from the fact England's and whole Britain and Western Europe do it too, their weather's terrible, and if you don't repeat the ceremonies, you'll get it lost, because you do need repetition, usually on an annual cycle, but not necessarily. They are performance sites. They're in chalk, most of them, or stone. The reverberation is superb. You've got flat bases where there's performance. You've got light reflecting to glory. In terms of performing information, embodied knowledge systems, as Margot keeps insisting I call them, performing down in those ditches would be sensational and highly memorable. So the stones are up there at the top giving you the memory palace, but they also buried things in the ditches, particular bones and so on. Then you've got the very secretive cairns, which they call tombs. I wish they wouldn't. Some of them didn't even have bodies in them. But these cairns, which were very restricted, and again, the acoustics would be very, very strong. So what you've got is something that enhances knowledge by such a huge amount, using what we are biologically driven to do. So you'll find the equivalent all over the world in different structures. In Britain, they use henge ditches because they're digging in chalk. You can't. So you'll get similar things in America where they use mounds to get the same sort of effect, but because it's not in chalk, they can't make them too deep, or else you kill everybody that goes down the bottom.
Yeah, I mean,
so I want one.
It would be an interesting thing to do a split test. So if you take your neighborhood that you mentioned walking through, and sometimes you use the details of the neighbors you speak with, and split test that against memorizing, say, a bunch of Mandarin terms or something in a ditch that would have been built, for you, and then you can stamp it down and so forth. It just reminded me, and I'm just speculating here because I'm not an expert in word origins, but pedagogy seems to me to have the word foot in it etymologically. And I believe that pedagogy in Greek really meant the servant that walked the student to school. That was what originally a pedagogue is. So, and I think of Latin with what is it? Salvatur ambulando. It is solved by walking. And you mentioned these giant images of monkeys and birds and stuff that people would walk as part of this performance.
In the Nazca lines, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean,
that's really interesting, because the Greeks taught memory palaces right through school. They were, and music and art were fundamental classes. But yes, they taught memory palaces using the textbook Ad Horrendum, which was used for years and years and years and years, centuries and centuries. So this idea of walking your knowledge was fundamental to them. And one of the research projects I'm really keen to do, one of the many that were sidelined for 3 years for this book, was with the Greek and Roman myths and legends. They're set around the mountains around Athens. But what we get are the actual stories. They leave out so much of the stuff that was part of them originally. So what they're actually leaving out is the repetition and the memory palace type concept, because they're more interested in the sex and vulgarity, which makes everything more memorable. Stories with lots of sex and vulgarity and ugly and beautiful and wild and violent are much more memorable. But I think if we go back, we'll find all the evidence of the memory palace. I'm not the first to suggest that, by the way. So that would be fascinating to look at the origins of the Greek words and see whether that actually is reflecting exactly what you're suggesting. So now you've just made another project that I can't wait to do.
Well, you have to stress test my memory there, but I
don't. You did do an either or, though, whether you use the ditch or I don't think that they did either or. I think they did both. I think they were compounding, and that's what this gene does. It compounds and links music and art and memory palaces and spatial ability. And I think it's the either or is a problem. I think using them together will reinforce each other in different ways and keep it more interesting.
Yeah. Well, on the matter of either or and this gene linking so many things, I'm probably going to make an inaccurate statement or base a question on an inaccuracy. And we know that there's artifice in the idea of the Renaissance. I mean, I think the Victorians made up the Renaissance, some people say. But nonetheless, there is a period where people like Giordano Bruno appear, Robert Flood, and on, and they become, in my reading, quite obsessed with the idea of knowing everything, which would have, I'm sure, something to do with the trivium and the quadrivium, and having, I don't know, like I feel like I think you mentioned information science in the knowledge gene as part of what these older cultures were on to, like a real deep understanding of information science. So when we talk about music and everything and art and so forth, there is this sort of period where mnemonics are really flourishing through these figures, and they have this attitude: we really can know it all, you know. And I often wonder, like, what do they mean by everything? And Giordano Bruno has this passage in his book on statues, 30 statues, which starts like "Abit ergo chaos non figuram non statuum, not statuem," something like this, right? And what he's saying there is, you know, we have chaos and we don't have an image of everything, but isn't it weird that we can actually talk about everything? Like infinity is basically what he means. So I think that he's starting to talk about recursion and patterns and set theory in a way, you know, the set of sets, so that you can start to see that in a facile way, but also a very profound way. Maybe you can know everything in if you are very generous with the word everything. Like you can see enough patterns, you can become a quote unquote Renaissance person that has some musical ability or an understanding of music, even if you don't play. You can have artistic sensibility. You could think about color and form and line and all this sort of stuff. And so I just wonder, like, is that what this gene is enabling to happen? The perception, not just of language or the use of language and so forth, but also just all of this to the extent that number, science, concepts of infinity and so forth really aren't all that divided necessarily.
I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it, because what I worry about has been lost in education, that you can see in that sort of education, is that a structure is laid down, which is the way Indigenous cultures all work, using landscape and devices and things, and then information is layered and layered and layered upon it. So once you've got a structure, you've got hooks for things. There's a big problem in education that every time you mention memory, they think you're talking about rote learning. And we've got to get rid of people linking memory and rote learning. Rote learning is repeating things without meaning over and over and over until you can't forget them. That's not what knowledge is about. Knowledge is about laying down these structures and then building and building on it. So I think you can glimpse everything if you've got a structure that links everything, intermeshed knowledge systems. But I also think the problem occurred in the Renaissance, that when the church set up schools and everybody was to sit quietly and learn the same way. And those that succeeded in schools, which were a very small proportion of the population, were those who could learn in that particular way. Now, in China, up to the 1950s, the literacy rate was incredibly low. At the beginning of the last century, it was around 10%. And then Mao Zedong brought in the 1950s pinyin because the characters are so difficult, and tried to get rid of those characters. So you've got all the evidence of these methods, of the music and the art and everything, performance, being used to spread information right up to the 1950s, including photos and everything. The literati would not allow the characters to be removed. And I believe it's to do with the fact that they are an art form as well. All the art engages with that. And they were part of performance and philosophy and everything. It was enmeshed. And what we've done is separated those things to our detriment. I'd like to see education go back to that sort of bigger picture with everything meshed. So here's a science geek who taught physics and maths and everything arguing for the arts.
Well, yeah, I mean, that seems like a good place to land, I think. As someone who has a PhD in humanities, I'm very sad to see humanities being stripped out of just about everything.
Well, we can
And
change that.
all right,
Okay.
well, maybe to bring everything to a close for now, what would you think are maybe the top two, three things that we need to do to keep changing things, or to accelerate the change so that we do have um, multiple forms of memory, multiple ways for multiple kinds of people to be able to learn in ways that suit them? Like, what are the big key uh, points that we really need to take action on that you think?
We need to see that we need to work as groups and diverse groups. We tend to seek out people that think the same as us. And that's what was a real shock when I had these people around the table. So I think the big thing is that we need to take advantage of all the potential that every single one of us has to use music and art and memory palaces and so on in our learning, and then also engage with diverse thinking. And 99% of human evolution and time, we adapted and could adapt in the way no other species could. But the evidence is so strong that music and art and place were absolutely fundamental to that. And we've sidelined them. So we've all got a massive potential born in us that we're not using.
Right. Well, let's get using it. And I mean, part of it is, I think the more you can remember, the more you're going to be sensitive to just how important.
And you can't be creative. Creativity is connecting things that haven't been connected before.
Mm.
If we just use Google to look up things and only learn what we're taught to learn, then we can't do that. We need that big platform to be able to be creative. And we need creativity to adapt and to solve the problems that the world's facing at the moment.
Well, Lynne, again, congrats again. The Knowledge Gene is monumental. And like I said, I think it could be just a resume for so many people here. This explains me. But thank you for writing it. And I know lots goes into these books. And for people who are interested, obviously they can search the Knowledge Gene. But if they want to know more about your work, what's the best way to find you? You
Just
prefer?
Google my name and come to the website.
Okay.
I'll be updating the website because more research. So I've set up a research website for the Knowledge Gene, but just come to my website, lynnekelly.com.au, and go from there.
Perfect. Well, thank you again for the chat, and I look forward to the next time.
It's been a pleasure, Anthony. It always is.
Well, I want to thank Lynne again for her time, her insight, her experience. She's put so much into understanding the ancient world, how memory techniques around the world were used across time, and actually going and finding the real objects. This is just one that I made in a class, but actually, holding them in her hands, the real deal, and studying and researching and figuring out as much as possible, and now going into the realm of genetics through the Knowledge Gene. You absolutely have to read this. It's unbelievable. And not only read it, make sure that you get copies for other people and help make this, what it deserves to be, which is something that could be part of a revolution. Educational reform is something I think about a lot. I really don't know how to do it other than to encourage people to not just get these books, but read them and gift them and use the techniques yourself. They're known, and the only thing we don't seem to know is why is it that some of us sort of hum and haw about it. And it may be a genetic thing, but at the end of the day, try and see if you can get yourself to do it if you're stuck. And if you're stuck, well, watch more videos like these, read more books by Lynne, and put these ideas into context, because the key thing about these. They're not even ideas. They're actually techniques that are so well evidenced it's not even funny. But the key is that Lynne draws out is that there is no one memory technique. There are many, many multiple techniques. There's no one way to sit in a classroom. There's not even one kind of classroom. But get involved and find a way to get involved. And I've got endless ideas. The real thing is to think inside yourself. What is it that blocks me if you're blocked? Or what is the time issue that I have if it's time? And work it out. Keep going, keep going, keep going. Stopping. One of my favorite mantras. And one of the ways that we stop ourselves from stopping is to continue researching, continue reading, but then put our reading into context by communicating with others. And that's another theme in this book, is that people that want knowledge to flourish, and how that our species has made knowledge flourish throughout time, is by boosting things that are valuable. And the poisons that Lynne talked about, or the foods that could be poisonous if they're not treated in a particular way, we project, stay away, stay away, stay away. And then the things that are really valuable, we just can't stop ourselves from projecting this is valuable. And it's always been great to see how many people boost Lynne's books. And so I'm glad to have the opportunity to boost it as well. So thumbs up for that. If you're new here and not subscribed, get subscribed, get the Knowledge Gene, make pictures of yourself with it, post it all over the internet. Let's do this thing, because time moves fast and our survival may be fleeting, and it's really up to you and me and us to make it happen. And if we don't, well, we'll probably deserve it. You know what I'm saying? So let's not end on a note like that. But we are at the moment where we could do so much to get together while the internet is still relatively open. So speed is the key. And thank you, as always, for helping me speed along. And until we have a chance to speak again, keep yourself magnetic. And if you want to follow up and listen to more of me talking with Lynne, I'll have a link somewhere on the screen in the description below for our previous discussion about memory craft. And there's even more discussions between Lynne and I in the history, in the archive, provided that the archive lasts. And that is in all of our hands.